Hello and welcome to Season 9, Episode 10 of Bad Gays, a podcast about evil and complicated queer people in history. I'm Ben Miller, a writer, historian, and member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin.
And I'm Hugh Lemmy, writer and author.
And we are so happy tonight to be recording live from Helsinki, Finland. You'll hear our wonderful audience in the background. We've encouraged them to make some noise, and you'll also get to hear some questions from them at the end. So, who are we talking about to close out our season, Hugh?
As always, I'd like to start with a bit of a story. So a number of years ago, I was on a road trip driving through the American South, and it was a real road movie style expedition in this sort of bust-up old Jeep Cherokee we'd borrowed from my boyfriend's brother-in-law, and we drove up Route 75 through the center of Florida and ending up going through Macon, Georgia, past these roadside billboards that were advertising everything from vasectomies to Jesus Christ, guns and ammo to Florida oranges and Georgia peaches. As a foreigner visiting the US, you often get this strange sensation of the uncanny. These are representations of places and lives you've seen all your life in the American movies and TV shows that have permeated Europe, or at least Western European visual culture since the end of World War II. But here it is, and it actually looks like that, a film set. I remember visiting New York in my early 20s and thinking, wow, it looks like New York. So that evening we got into Atlanta, Georgia, and we wanted a beer, so we went to this little bar called Friends, which was a gay bar lined with chipboard walls and pool tables and neon lights, and it was above a tattoo parlor in a strip mall. And I went to the bathroom, and there was a condom dispenser offering free condoms. Fantastic. And I looked at the packet and immediately recognized the illustrations. To me, it was as pure Americana as you can possibly get, this shirtless cowboy with bulging pecs, grabbing the outline of his big cock in his jeans, or these two muscled, mustachioed clones with big nipples and floppy hair embracing.
But did you get me their numbers, Hugh?
I think you've already met them. So in all likelihood, you'll recognize them too. I've seen the same pictures actually in my local cruise bar in Barcelona. In the little room where you strip down to your jockstrap before you go in, there's these yellow posters that are pinned with thumbtacks to the wall with the same illustrations on. And even if you don't visit the sort of salubrious and well-decorated bars that I do, you'll recognize this distinctive drawing style and subject too. Originally from softcore porn mags and sex shop postcards, they now adorn notebooks and calendars and t-shirts and tea towels and coasters and even Christmas ornaments and room diffusers, and actual room diffusers, not a euphemism for poppers. Although, of course, they do adorn popper bottles too. And they are in their way pure Americana, but for a European audience especially, motorcycle cops and sailors and cowboys and construction workers. But they also appealed to other European imaginaries of the US, from a culture of anti-black racism and fetishism to a form of homosexuality, seemingly detached from cosmopolitan and old world ways of being gay, where men are real men fucking without labels. It's the same erotic charge that underpins perhaps films like Brokeback Mountain, this Wild West conception of masculinity that's so hyper-masculine that it allows for sodomy without seeming effeminate. And of course, they are images that emerge definitively out of a post-war Europe looking to this new cultural superpower, the United States. They were drawn by today's subjects, the Finnish artist and illustrator Tuukka Laaksonen, better known by his pen name Tom of Finland. So Tom has always been, and apologies in advance for any mispronunciations I make of the Finnish language. I've been trying to learn the words. So Tom has always been a controversial figure, and the way the reception to his work has changed can actually tell us quite a lot about how social attitudes towards sexuality and obscenity have changed in the century since his birth. Originally, his illustrations were controversial because of his graphic depictions of gay sex, of sodomy and cocksucking and fisting, in a pre-liberation, pre-internet age, where his work was mainly distributed through pornography networks. But today, things have changed so much so you can buy Tom-branded products in department stores like Selfridges in the UK, and books of his drawings in Barnes & Noble in the US. But at the same time, his representations of both black men and of, let's say, Nazi-influenced aesthetics have drawn new criticisms to his work, even while the fisting and piss and cocksucking have become perfect home decorations. And the influence of his work on gay male sex cultures, on ideals of queer masculinities, and especially on leather scenes, remains both enormous but also contested, something I think Ben can talk about later. But I want to get started on Tom's own story and how this skinny little gay kid from the south of Finland, clutching his pencil and notebook, would go on to be perhaps the most influential figure in the creation of what I saw in those bars from Atlanta to Barcelona, a kind of international gay male aesthetic. So Tom was born in the small town of Kaarina near the city of Turku in the south of Finland. It was 1920, just 3 years after Finland had declared its independence from the Russian Empire in the wake of the Russian Revolution. There was a brief but very bloody civil war in 1918 between the Red Guards, who were a paramilitary force in favour of emulating Bolshevik policies in Russia, and the White or Civil Guards, who represented the anti-communist forces, especially of business owners and peasantry, over what sort of country Finland would be, which ended in victory for the Whites and, with the end of World War I, the establishment of a republic. This struggle with the soon-to-be-established Soviet Union, sharing an enormous land border with Finland, would shape Tom's young life, and in turn the development of his sexual tastes and mores as a young man. He was born to two school teachers in an otherwise pretty rural environment and raised on the school grounds where his extended family lived. His family was very invested in education and in culture, and his childhood was spent reading, drawing, acting in plays, and especially playing the piano, at which he was very talented. Okay. But his attention was drawn as a teen to what he would call real men, in contrast to his father, who, though handsome, in Tom's words, quote, was not a real man, in my eyes. He wore a white collar and worked indoors, using his mind rather than his body, end quote. So if you're looking for archetypal forms of traditional masculinity, then you could do a lot worse than Tom's hometown, which boasted lumberjacks working in the forestry industry, as well as farmers and soldiers and policemen, all of whom would come to form the focus of Tom's later career. But he started young. A comic strip that still exists from when he was just 6 or 7 shows a gang of policemen coming to save a family, and they're kind of butch, even though it's a kid's drawing. And throughout his childhood, he became a proficient draftsman, and his early work has this real charm to it. And he attended secondary school in Turku, but by the time he graduated, he was ready to get out of his small town and experience city life. That's a story I think we all know quite well. So he moved to Helsinki, where he studied advertising. And this was a canny move that was supported by his parents, because it married his talent for art with an opportunity for a steady career. But the idealistic young Tom didn't quite see it that way. He would later say, quote, "Studying advertising was not what I expected it to be at all. I was burning with a desire to be a real artist, and all they were teaching me was business," end quote. His biographer, the wonderfully named F. Valentine Hooven III,
we did the research for this and we found the biography. I was like, by who? It's amazing. Is there a gay? Have we ever heard a gayer name than F. Valentine Hooven III?
The thing is, it could be like a gay author's pseudonym, but it could also be an American name. But he suggests that this more practical education that he was embarked on was something wasted upon Tom, who just wanted to draw. But I think there's a key actually here to understanding the reception of his work over the years. In the decades since Tom's death, and especially in the last 15 years or so, there's been a concerted move to resituate Tom's art within a contemporary art context. But the conditions under which Tom worked for nearly his whole life were those of a commercial artist. The market of contemporary art attributes a value to scarcity, in part. And this is the exact opposite of how Tom made his money, as we'll see. Tom's work was pornography, and I don't say that at all to dismiss it, but just honestly, that's the context it was made in. His work was reproduced multiple times, and the more reproductions he sold, the more money he made. Very few people were interested in buying his drawings as works of art, and fewer still as investments when he was drawing them, which is the heart of what the contemporary art market is today. So I think it's worth bearing in mind Tom's roots as a commercial artist when we discuss his work in this episode, and especially when we discuss how he talked about his work, because that was just as much part of selling the fantasy as the drawings themselves, which is in many ways similar to the way contemporary art works. But he was just 19 when he arrived in Helsinki to continue his studies, and it was the autumn of 1939. His plans were interrupted by the eruption of World War II. Finland had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, but in November of that year, the Soviet Union used a false flag attack on a Russian village as a pretext to abandon the treaty and invade in what would later be called the Winter War. The Soviets were supremely confident about their chances, Andrei Zhdanov, who was the Leningrad party boss, who was also one of the main architects of the cultural policy of socialist realism, had even commissioned Shostakovich to write Suite on Finnish themes that was to be played by Red Army bands during their victory march through Helsinki. The march, however, wasn't to be. The Soviets experienced much fiercer resistance than they expected, but they were the materially superior force, and after two major offensives in the winter and spring, an interim peace was reached in March 1940. During this peace, Finland changed its approach. Unable to convince the Allies, who had enough of their own problems in 1940 to support them, the government turned to Nazi Germany for military aid. Hitler was already deep into planning Operation Barbarossa, his eventually disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union that would start in June of the following year. But being able to operate in Finland and with Finnish support would bring him much closer to Leningrad and also allow him to cut off Soviet railway access to its port at Murmansk, the Soviets' only northern port that's ice-free all year round. The Finns began rearming and calling up more men to the army, and by the start of Operation Barbarossa, the army was about 500,000 men strong, which for a country with fewer than 4 million residents is a massive mobilization. And in the end, Finland would recruit over 60% of its total male population into the military. Tom, just turning 20, was obviously one of those recruits. He was posted to an anti-aircraft base on Suomenlinna, an island fortress that guards the entrance to Helsinki. And Tom served with distinction, rising to the rank of lieutenant, commanding his own air defense crew, and even receiving the Order of Liberty, pinned to his chest by Field Marshal Mannerheim, the commander-in-chief of the Finnish military, and later the president of Finland personally. He was also well liked by his troops. He started one of the first military choirs in Finland, and he put his erotic art on hold, but he drew many portraits of his fellow soldiers for their girlfriends, and after the war, 24 of them were put on in an exhibition of soldiers' artwork in Helsinki. So the country was officially at least still neutral, and not an ally of Nazi Germany, but nonetheless it began to fill with German troops, from 67,000 in 1941 to over 200,000 Germans by 1944. In June of 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, and a few days later, responding to Soviet air raids, the Finns launched their own attack on the Soviets, taking back much of the land they'd lost in the interim peace. The Finns called this the Continuation War. Meanwhile, German soldiers in the north of the country advanced on the rail link to Murmansk, an objective they fortunately never achieved. The Finnish government would claim to be co-belligerents with Nazi Germany and not allies, but the extent of the agreements between the two have been contested by historians and politicians ever since. So this is military history, but Tom was far more interested in military aesthetics. While in Helsinki, Tom had got to explore his sexuality in a wider context than the schoolboy fumblings he'd experienced at home. The onset of the war and the presence of German troops would become a huge influence on Tom's work for the rest of his career. Tom's attraction to uniforms was something approaching a fetish for the object, more than a mere desire for the military man. He would later say, quote, "Sometimes the attraction to the uniform is so powerful in me that I feel as if I am making love to the clothes, and the man inside them is just a convenience to hold them up and fill them out, sort of an animated display rack," end quote. But what does this mean in the context of the later drawings that he'd make of Nazis? He would try to diminish these as non-ideological, saying, quote, "The whole Nazi philosophy, the racism and all that is hateful to me, but of course I drew them anyway. They had the sexiest uniforms." So what does it mean to try and separate a uniform from an ideology? Is that really possible? Surely the uniform, even more than the man inside it, represents the ideology. Or is Tom's claim purely that the cut and the fit of the uniform is the only thing that attracts him to it? In the military, Tom killed at least one man. Later in life, he remembered, quote, "One night I was taking my turn on watch, patrolling the perimeter of our gun emplacement. As a lieutenant, I was not required to stand guard patrol like the rest of my men were, but I was not that kind of officer. It was so dark that I did not see the Russian paratrooper on the path ahead of me until we were just a few feet apart. He was facing away, frantically rolling up his parachute to hide it. I could not use my pistol because who knew how many others were nearby? So I used the knife. I put it in his back where I judged his heart to be, and he fell forward on his face. There was no remorse. It was him or me. In the morning, we turned him over. He was young and beautiful, so beautiful he was like an angel in uniform," end quote. It wasn't just uniforms and Nazis that the war gave to Tom. The blackout in Helsinki also opened up the opportunity for cruising and public sex, something that he took to like a duck to water. He would go cruising at the Esplanade Park and on Observatory Hill, and he would have sex with both Finnish and German soldiers. But his war was relatively quiet until close to the end in 1944, when the Soviets, having launched a massive offensive to relieve the siege of Leningrad, pushed on through to the Karelian Isthmus. The stretch of land they'd first taken from Finland in the interim peace and then lost during the continuation war. The Nazis insisted that Finland resisted and not sue for a separate peace, and in return offered more weapons to the Finns. So Tom was sent to fight for the first time on the Eastern Front, and it must have been truly hellish. The Soviets had 200 artillery pieces for every kilometre of the front, so that's an artillery piece for every 5 metres. The fact that he survived is near miraculous, battling the Soviet paratroopers landing right on top of his position, and he must have seen an awful lot of slaughter in the close combat fighting. The president and also Field Marshal Mannerheim knew that the Finnish war economy was fully spent. In 1944, the president resigned, Mannerheim took up the presidency and sued for peace with the Soviets, returning to the borders drawn up in 1940. The war for Finland and for Tom was over. Back in Helsinki, his life in the aftermath of war was pretty grim. Undoubtedly, there must have been trauma from his experiences, and he began to drink heavily. He began to study music at the prestigious Sibelius Academy, to play in piano bars in the evening, to resume his advertising studies, and also to begin to work commercially in advertising. On top of this, he began to draw his erotic works again. For a while, he frequented some of the bars that allowed homosexuals to meet there, but he was dismissive of what he perceived as feminine and queenie gaze. And you see his desire for trade, for these hyper-masculine archetypes, even for a more political masculinism emerging at this time. The Soviet military, uniquely I believe in Europe, allowed their soldiers to actually take leave and visit Helsinki, and he began cruising with them. He later said, quote, "They acted very cold, at least by Finnish standards." They were mostly straight, but that didn't stop them. To fuck a boy was just an interesting change from a girl, end quote. This ideal is something we see in a lot of queer literature at the time, and not only from a masculinist perspective. Quentin Crisp's theory of the great dark man fits into this same ideal, although with a little more wit to it. It's the invert pervert model raising its ugly head, not just amongst heterosexuals, but amongst the development of the gay man in the post-war era across the West. And it becomes, if not an obsession, at least a lifelong focus for his work. This idea of the real man, not the sissy gay. But Tom's post-war life after that was not unpleasant. The post-war economic boom in much of Europe as a result of the Marshall Plan, which pumped American money and culture into the continent as a bulwark against the communist East, and in America as a result of the victory in the war, would lead to another boom in magazine publishing. So this had two impacts on Tom's life. The first, as anyone who's ever watched Mad Men will tell you, is that the 1950s became a golden age for advertising and for using sex to sell. The second impact was the opening up of a real market for his drawings. As a result, Tom was finding work and making money. He started as a freelance illustrator, but in the early 1950s he joined an advertising agency and his career soared. By the end of the decade, he was the artistic director of the agency, a role he would stay in until the 1970s. The work gave him a decent lifestyle by the standards of post-war Finland, and he began to travel, especially to Germany and Sweden, where he became more aware of the US magazines that gay men were buying. He was still cruising too. But it was one evening in 1953 when Tom was walking through Helsinki that he saw a young man loitering on a street corner. They got chatting. His name was Veli Markkanen. He was a dancer, 21 years old, and new in town. So they fucked, but it was to be no casual thing. Soon Veli moved in with Tom, and they would become lovers. Although as homosexuality was still illegal in Finland until 1971, they maintained a facade to his family that Veli was Tom's roommate.
So about those magazines that Tom was reading in Finland and Sweden, they included magazines like Physique Pictorial, that was published out of Los Angeles, and Tom's work started to be published in and circulate in those magazines. There were some publishing contexts in which certain kinds of fully nude photography were not allowed. So there were some magazines that could include drawings of things that could not be potentially legally depicted in a photograph. And that was one of the places where this whole generation of erotic artists, of whom Tom was the first and most famous, began to emerge. In contrast to Finland, Sweden decriminalized homosexuality in 1944, and many other Scandinavian countries began to print fairly open gay and pornographic material much earlier than in other European and Western countries. For a Danish publisher called DFT in the 1960s, Tom invented a new character who would become one of his first kind of steady character hits. A Finnish, oversexed motorcyclist with a giant bulge pressing out of his leather chaps. Tom's friend, the Swedish publisher Michael Holm, asked him for a name, and he chose the name of his friend, Kaka. In Finnish, it's pronounced kaka, which sounds like cock, but in English, people said cake, which also means ass. Fetish, as we've talked about, emerges from social fear. I think it's interesting that before the two world wars, almost all fetish roleplay circulated around roles within the feudal household. That's where the kind of French maid stereotype comes from. Everything was about lords and ladies and maids and stable boys. After the Second World War, everything becomes about uniforms, right? Big surprise. With brown leather slowly starting to turn to black, a kind of fetish iconography that had been born of fears of soldiers and attraction to soldiers merged into a post-war fear of this new youth generation with its freedom and its lack of respect for traditional morals and ways of life. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause had profiled these new youth cultures of bikers and gangsters, and a new generation of gay teens was watching them and developing a new fetish for a new kind of bad boy. That's why I wore a motorcycle jacket onto this stage, right? Tom was ready to serve that up. A genius of advertising, his use of similar, even generic faces on his characters allowed anyone to imagine themselves into the scene. He sold gay men a version of ourselves as the men that we wanted to fuck. And he made his bikers friendly, happy, smiling. This was part of the instantiation of what became known as the gay clone look. This look was well summed up by a book called The Butch Manual, The Current Dragon, How to Do It, by Clark Henley, which was recently reissued by Dark Entries Records. It's great. And in that book, Henley explained to a generation of men now 10 to 15 years into their caca fantasies how to throw away their fringe pillows and signed Judy Garland record collections and become the kinds of men they fantasized about. He wrote, quote, "No one was born butch." He also wrote that being butch required a body. To quote the Butch Manual, "People are looking for a body. People do not want to fuck your car, or your Cuisinart, or your collection of rare children's books. No one has ever said, I want to fuck that fabulous quiche recipe."
I think I've said that.
And that explains why you're dressed like that.
Ouch.
Was that too mean? No, anyway, whatever. I told you that I was going to do a bit about this like transition from a different guy and whatever. Anyway.
I'm growing old gracefully.
And I'm not old yet. So, you've never done this. Do you figure out how to get back into this? Because I don't think I want to put that in the episode. People are going to think that Daddy and Daddy are fighting. All right, so back to the script. People do not want to fuck your car, or your Cuisinart, or your collection of rare children's books. No one has ever said, I want to fuck that fabulous quiche recipe. So Butch works out every single day and has a body, end quote. And this was the beginning, or at least part of the beginning, of what I've called in the script, every word capitalized, the gay guy body thing, which my gym membership is living proof of. The body thing was neither purely liberation, nor was it purely reactionary. For a generation of gay men, the idea that they could be men was a revelation, that they could maybe even do masculinity better than the straights. Gay liberation had a lot of components. One of them was this early 70s long-haired rejection of traditional gender roles, but another was the rejection of the idea that gay life was tragic and sexless, that gay men were resigned to live their lives alone in apartments with bugle bead curtains and white Siamese cats, listening to Edith Piaf records and weeping about their lack of a lover. Tom, a brilliant advertiser, sold us on the idea that we could be fully realized and sexual adults. Some of us could even top. One of those new gay liberation presses was called Revolt, and it was founded in Stockholm by Michael Holm, Tom's former editor in Denmark. Holm pursued what was then and remains a revolutionary policy of treating authors and artists well and paying them fairly. And so for Revolt, Tom continued to produce Kaka works, as well as creating a new character, a lumberjack named Pekka, who was blonde and blue-eyed.
Named Pekka.
Pekka. Yeah. Cock and Pekka. Subtle. As the Pekka books sold better and better, and as more and more countries overturned laws forbidding the distribution of various kinds of material as obscene, Tom gradually came to the conclusion that he could quit his job in advertising, and did so in 1973. Around the same time, he cut back on his drinking, celebrated 20 years with Veli, and was circumcised. He idealized circumcised American dick, and he wanted his dick to look more American. Freed from the daily pressure of work at the advertising studio, Tom was able to develop his artwork. His trademark photorealistic style extended to doodling on photos, so he would work out his drawings in these rough sketches that would be composed from different photos on tracing paper, and then he'd tape them together to figure out the composition, overlay onto a sheet, set down the composition, and then fill in the drawing with all that careful shading. Gerhard Pohl, a friend and client of Tom's from Hamburg, introduced Tom to his friends Harold and Peter. Harold was the heir to a canned goods fortune, and they wanted to use the money to open a gay bar. At this time, Hamburg had the best gay nightlife in Germany, and Hamburg is the point where Scandinavia meets mainland Europe. So Tom made huge murals above the bar and in the back room. The bar was called Tom's Saloon. It is still open. If you go to Hamburg, you can visit it. An attempt to take the brand global failed, but a copycat bar did open in Berlin that was called Tom's Bar, and it was open from the 80s until 2024, when it was bought and replaced by a local outpost of the Barcelona-based twink sex club Boyberry. I blame you, Hugh.
They missed a selling point for Boyberry, which is Spanish twinks.
Pohl was also intent on introducing Tom to friends in the United States, where Tom's work had been circulating since the physique pictorial days, but where the artist himself hadn't yet been. He introduced Tom to the owners of a gallery in Los Angeles called Eons, who agreed to produce a calendar if Tom would show the original drawings. This was 1978, so the calendar, which depicted pairs of clothed and naked men, was for the year 1979. Tom, at this point, was suspicious of invitations to do exhibits. His work, when it was exhibited in galleries, often had a nasty habit of going missing. As we'll hear later, he spent a lot of time in the end of his life trying to find all of the work that people had absconded with, but he did agree to go. So upon arrival, he was met at the airport by a man that he'd been corresponding with. Apparently, his correspondents had a habit of pretending they looked like his models and then not looking like his models. So he was pleasantly surprised to meet his correspondents. He later recalled, quote, "I'm always nervous going through customs, even though this time I had not one single dirty drawing in my luggage. The airport, like all airports, was crowded and confusing. I was looking around for a fat old man, and suddenly this guy sticks out his hands, smiles, and says, 'Hi, I'm Dirk. You must be Tom.' I could not believe my eyes. It was the muscular blonde god from the photo," end quote. So all those years later, Tom still looked for his blonde gods. Sebastian was famished for blondes. Dirk came from the oil prairies of Alberta, Canada. He was an early bloomer. At the age of 13, he began both the practice of transcendental meditation and the practice of cruising. He was a bisexual hippie child who fathered a son at 16 and hosted 15-person love-in orgies in his parents' home. As the 1970s went on, Dirk, like so many, transitioned from hippie to leatherman. We call them male-to-male transsexuals. And he actually I know many. And he came second in 1979's International Mr. Leather, which was the second one of those. He had agreed to host Tom, and so the two men left the airport and went home to Dirk's house in the Silver Lake neighborhood. And this was the heyday of post-Stonewall, pre-AIDS gay life in LA. Bars, parties, clubs, Tom had a great time. There was a place in Silver Lake called the Silver Dollar Saloon. It was a Western-themed leather bar, and there was a Silver Saddle Spa bathhouse upstairs, and bath guests had what was known as in and out privileges. So you could get a room at the bathhouse, go down to the bar, bring people up to the room in the bathhouse, send them back down to the bar, etc. At the gallery opening, Tom recalled, quote, "In the middle of everything, somebody knelt down and licked my chaps from boots to crotch." Goals for the evening. The exhibit was a success, and soon Tom had another exhibit in San Francisco that was hosted at Fenway Studios. Fun fact, that gallery was owned by Robert Opel, who was the guy who streaked the Oscars in 1973. And at that studio, he met a photographer who was going to host a show there after Tom, someone you may have heard of. His name was Bobby Mapplethorpe, Robert Mapplethorpe. Tom recalled, quote, "In spite of his wild looks, he was quiet and somehow shy. Anyway, he wanted to show me his new photo prints for the coming exhibition, and I'll remember for the rest of my life how panicked I was when I by accident dribbled wine from my glass across the photos. 'No problem,' he said, and calmly washed them off and hung them up to dry again." Can you imagine meeting Robert Mapplethorpe and the first thing you do is spill a glass of red wine on one of Mapplethorpe? Anyway, she got him back, you'll see later. When Tom flew to the US, he would often change into his full leathers, but after customs and before leaving the airport, so that basically whoever met him would get this like version of him. Again, we see this guy really understanding how to sell himself, right? So when he had his first show in New York City, Dirk, who also had this kind of brain, decided that he wanted to really make a spectacle. So he recruited a bunch of biker club members to create a motorcycle phalanx in front of his car, and they managed to get him from Kennedy into New York City in under a half hour, which if anyone has ever been to New York City, you know that's not a thing that people normally do. Tom was really impressed by New York and its beautiful men. While he was there, he met one of his sort of colleagues or comrades, an artist who went by the name Etienne. Other great erotic artists of this time include Rex, who did the poster for the famous bar, the Mine Shaft in New York, which we'll talk about in a minute. And Tom recalled, quote, "By then, meeting Etienne in person, it didn't surprise me to find out his Latin looks were every bit as handsome as the guys he drew. I never met a real guy who looked like the ones I drew until I came to the US. American men care about their looks and their bodies and their health. They take much better care of themselves than European men do." And I want to think a little bit here about what we're talking about when we talk about health, right? Bodybuilding is not particularly the kind of exercise that you do if you are exercising to maximize your health, right? And in fact, there are many ways that people trying to look like a Tom of Finland drawing, steroids, very common at various times in gay life, right? That's actually health negative, right? So what do we mean by health is, I think, an interesting question to think about here. But anyway, he's in New York. Robert Mapplethorpe showed him around. He had a show at the Robert Samuelson Gallery. And then after the show, Tom went to the Mine Shaft and apparently realized that his imagination had not only come to life, but in fact that reality had exceeded his imagination. He also met a porn photographer named Lou Thomas, who had a boyfriend who was very large and very handsome and very stupid. Apparently, at one dinner party, they were at some dinner party in some kind of fabulous gay apartment, and the host had a fish tank full of piranhas, and the boyfriend decided to stick his hand in to see if they would bite. They did. So Dirk was the one who helped Tom establish this business that we talked about in the beginning, right? This whole world of tea towels and room diffusers, that all comes from Dirk. And it all started with Dirk's idea of setting up a company to sell drawing sets by mail order. Until then, everything was either in books or things that were then reprinted in magazines. The first sets were made out of the top sheets from the calendar that hadn't sold. They just cut them off the calendar part and sold them in nice boxes. They sold out really fast, and Dirk came up with the idea of setting up a stable business. The idea was to keep Tom's work in print and in circulation, and also to bring in a lot of money. Now, Veli was somewhat suspicious of Dirk, maybe not least because Dirk was very young and very handsome, but Tom agreed, and they set up the Tom of Finland company. And Tom and Dirk then began figuring out the rights picture for all of his past work, trying to get originals with which various companies had absconded. They started making new Kaka comics, and as editions sold out, they would reprint them in higher quality, and each new book contained what they called Tom's archives, which were archives of old drawings in the back. And the fact that this was bringing in money was good because these gallery shows in the US, once again, people had not paid him money, people absconded with drawings. Even that Robert Samuelson gallery, co-owned by Mapplethorpe, actually absconded with some drawings and didn't pay properly. I think someday we have to do a Robert Mapplethorpe episode.
Yes, we do, yeah.
Him and Miss Patti Smith have a lot to answer for. As Tom aged, his men became no less nomadic, but they aged a bit. They grew facial hair, their hairlines receded, things with which I'm familiar. And as porn photos began to be allowed, Tom started drawing his cocks bigger and bigger, the theory being that the drawing had to have something unique to offer.
This is my response as a writer to AI. You just have to make it so filthy that AI won't produce it.
So in 1980, Tom and Veli traveled to America for the first time. Veli met Dirk, and they stayed in Los Angeles together, all three, in Dirk's new Craftsman house for several days. But Veli already knew something horrible. He had throat cancer and would soon die. In his last months, Veli had an affair in Paris with the erotic artist Bastille, and then returned to Helsinki to die. Tom later recalled, quote, "In the 10 years since Veli died, he has never really left me. Every now and then I hear him go galumphing through the house the way he used to, or I feel someone standing close behind me and know it is him. Usually I find his presence very comforting, but once in a while, when I'm trying to draw, he will suddenly whistle or blow in my ear, infuriating me the same damn way he loved to do when he was alive." And Veli's death ushered in an era of death. It was 1981. A rare cancer had just been discovered in several homosexuals. HIV and AIDS were beginning to sweep through Tom's world of big, beautiful young men. The dying, the wasting. It began with Tom's American friends. It continued with his Finnish friends. AIDS also began to change the meaning of Tom's drawings. At first, they had been unachievable fantasies, advertisements for a kind of gay masculinity they were calling into existence. Then they became models to imitate, seemingly attainable goals for the clone generation. Finally, they became symbols of a lost idol. They were always already nostalgic, looking back to forms of traditional masculinity that modern gay life had departed from, and they became more so. Tom knew it too, mourning the death not only of his friends, but of a way of life. As the 80s went on, Dirk began to take on more and more control over Tom's international publishing. Many of those moves met from resistance from Tom's less reputable publishers, but his old friend Michael Holm from Revolt Press always cooperated and toured them through Sweden. By the way, it was in 1981 that homosexuality stopped being classified as a disease in Finland. As Tom aged, Dirk was determined to create a foundation that would preserve Tom's drawings and reputation even after his death. There were thousands of works, but given that they had been distributed as pornography, they often faced complex preservation challenges. Some of them had been destroyed by the post office, others had been destroyed by owners who had given up promiscuity, and others by the shocked family of people who died of AIDS-related illness. Some others had been drawn on cheap, acid-filled paper that just rotted the drawings out from underneath themselves. But Dirk was a genius for using commercial sales of products and books to fund this preservation project, and this was the beginning of the Tom of Finland Foundation, which still uses licensing fees from commercial sales and products to fund its mission of not only preserving Tom's work, but also supporting erotic artists, including funding residencies for erotic artists in that same craftsman-style house in Los Angeles. So all of the Tom of Finland crap, like the vodka and the tea towels and the room diffusers and the harnesses and all of the licensing, it all goes back to the foundation, which supports the work of the foundation.
And some really great artists.
Yes.
There's some really interesting people go and have residencies there.
Absolutely, including Florian Hetz, who took my extremely safe for work headshots. This went along with the official art world taking more and more notice of Tom's work. So as the 80s went on, he was making a better and better living from a combination of gallery sales and Dirk's energetic management of his business. But in 1987, Tom was diagnosed with emphysema. Because of the diagnosis, he had to decide he could no longer fly back and forth from LA all the time. It was a 10-hour flight. It was too much with the emphysema. And so he had to decide where to die. And he decided to settle and live out the rest of his life in Helsinki because he said he was too much of a cheapskate to pass up on the opportunity of socialized medicine. He lived in a beautiful Art Nouveau flat and studio with big bay windows and still took commissions, albeit at a much slower rate. And one of his last drawings, one that I think is really interesting, is a portrait of a bartender at a leather bar in Helsinki named Vicky. And what's interesting about it is that he portrays a kind of new generation of leathermen who's bringing in punk aesthetics. So you have a mohawk on a Tom of Finland, which is really interesting, I think, to see and unexpected. Tom hated being ill. He hated being in the hospital. There were many indignities. He told one friend by phone, "Do you know what the nurses here have done to me? When I came back from my shower, they made me wear pink pajamas. I'm so glad you can't see me. Me, Tom of Finland, in pink." In November of 1991, Tom died at the age of 71. That same year, the first documentary made about him had been released in Finland. And not until 1999 did Finland strike a law prohibiting incitement to homosexual behavior. After Tom's death, his work continued to circulate. And I think we should understand Tom's images as part of a shift from the invert-pervert model to modern homosexuality. His images became popular in physique pictorials and other gay porn magazines, which created communities of print, proving to readers by their very existence that there were other men who shared their sexual interests, that they were men who wanted to fuck and be fucked by men, not inverts desperately seeking trade. Many kinds of advertisers stepped in to shape those desires. Tom was one of them. As gay men abandoned inversion, Tom's drawings sold them, us, the idea that we could be the people that we wanted to fuck. And at the time, this was revolutionary. And as a writer named Hugh Lemmy once wrote of a different peddler of sexy gay fantasies, Wolfgang Tillmans, quote, "If that image offends me, then my own life offends me. And it's not his fault our love is no longer subversive or our constraints unrefused." Tom's legacy has come under criticism several times. The first was a 1970s article that brought some of the Nazi iconography to light. Tom's response was to say, quote, "In my drawings, I have no political statements to make, no ideology. I am thinking only about the picture itself," end quote. Yet, he did withdraw these drawings from circulation. His work then came under sustained attack in the 2000s from noted TERF Sheila Jeffreys. That critique, I think, is pretty easy to bat back, as is the supposed defense that Tom's work is actually a parody of masculinity. Tom expressed pleasure whenever he met men who lived up to the ideal, and disappointment when they didn't. That doesn't seem like parody to me. I also find unconvincing the argument that Tom's work is homonormative. I don't necessarily think that giant bulging cocks and hypersexuality are the ingredients of marriage-oriented assimilationism. Hunter Scott quite aptly points out that the whiteness of Tom's figures often goes unmarked but is central to their meaning. Tom drew a happy sexual utopia of normatively, if not exclusively, white men, and not very often racialized men marked by extremely racialized depictions, eroticized racial depictions of those men, and that imagery became the currency of white-dominated gay sexual desire. And as we said at the beginning, some of these men were literally Nazis. Nazi play itself has a long and complex history in gay fetish circles. Arnie Kantrowitz's very smart essay, Swastika Toys, originally published in the essential 1990 essay collection Leatherfolk, sums it up. Quote, "Attempts to discourage sex objectification have clearly failed, and I think it is widely agreed that politically correct sex rarely leads to orgasm. Though we cannot expect to alter behavior which is based on deep-seated needs, it is not out of order to educate people about the implications of the imagery they employ and the valid reactions triggered in others when they make their private fantasies publicly visible. Since we cannot and should not police the imaginations of others, it seems pointless to get upset over their private fantasies. But it is somewhat disconcerting to see an era of sexual politics, which made sexuality a part of history, give way to an era of political sexual fantasies, which reduce history to a visual aid." In the essay, Kantrowitz describes Tom's decision to remove the Nazi drawings from circulation after having learned that, quoting Tom, "People saw them in a political way. They thought I was a Nazi. I wouldn't do them today because I wouldn't want people to see them that way. They are my fantasies. Only a fascist," Kantrowitz ends his essay, "would ask for anything more." Now, this conversation exploded into broader public consciousness earlier this year when a member of Onyx, which is a US-based leather organization for Black and brown people of color, made social media posts revealing to the world what was an open secret. Dirk Daner, in his 80s, and then still president of the Tom of Finland Foundation and a judge at International Mr. Leather, had often been photographed in Nazi gear and had expressed interest in race play on a fetish website. Daner was swiftly stripped of his positions in IML and at the Tom of Finland Foundation, and they put out a statement saying that Daner had, quote, acted on his own accord and without our knowledge, end quote, and that, quote, the foundation will never tolerate hate while we work to preserve the legacy of Tom of Finland's artwork, end quote. And my answer to that is, really, girls? This is supposed to be a surprise? A brilliant essay by Karta Monir, who is an erotic artist who had been in residency at the Tom of Finland Foundation. She's also a trans woman of color, and she assessed the moment as a failed opportunity to have an adult conversation about what fetish play actually is, which is the eroticization of extreme forms of power and power differentials that has a history in specifically the veneration of the most brutal forms of white supremacy. Given that white supremacy has been a founding source of global violence, and given that kink eroticizes our greatest social fears, it would frankly be odd if the history of fetish play had nothing to do with that kind of violence. Monir wrote, quote, when I would tell people about my residency, one of the first things I would say was, there's a lot of Nazi shit. Tom's Finnish military uniform, proudly on display in his former bedroom, has a medal on his chest emblazoned with a swastika. He was a skinny twerp. It makes sense to me that he so strongly eroticized men who wanted to kill him, end quote. Monir also quotes Dirk himself, writing that, quote, gay men took the Nazi uniform and its accessories, improving it by making it out of leather and tailoring only a fashion-forward male could do. If there are any people who warrant the use of Nazi gear, it is those who have been abused by them. Gays are one such group, end quote. Monir expresses profound personal discomfort with Nazi eroticism and also cop fetishism. She writes, quote, kink is complicated to explain to people who might exist outside its containers, but essentially, I felt confident that the Nazi stuff was a sex thing, in the same way that I feel comfortable living with people who participate in rough, consensual non-consent play, also known as rape play, without feeling like they are rapists, or people who do intense age play without feeling that they endorse or commit pedophilia. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and a trans woman of color with a severe disability, and I know the hypnotic and restorative power of engaging in fantasy that directly confronts past traumas and things that scare you and threaten your existence, end quote. But, and this is key, doing it in public is different. People doing intense consensual race play in private is one thing, but screaming racial slurs at someone in a leather bar, even if you're both turned on by them, is a very different matter. And for me, as for Carla Monir, wearing a swastika to a leather bar or wearing a swastika to judge a leather competition is in that latter category. Daner, Monir wrote, has done work to uplift marginalized artists, yet she agreed that he should have stepped down for the foundations for what she described as, quote, his irresponsible decision to bring his Nazi fetish out of the privacy of his bedroom and into public spaces. She wrote, quote, I don't feel anger for anyone who called Dirk out. My anger is pointed at those institutions that stand for leather history and obscene displays of queer sexuality, but who can't admit that Dirk's behavior is entirely consistent with their own culture and history. It's the role of the foundation, she goes on, to provide a space for queer people to be messy little freaks, but it is not the role of the foundation to shield art or artists or anyone else from reasonable criticism. Intense work is going to generate intense discussions. Tom's work is complicated, frequently racist, and hugely influential. End quote. And I don't think we can put it any better than that.
We talked a lot about how Tom came from his advertising background and how his work was like both very influential in creating a market, but also in meeting the needs of that market. You mentioned the sort of way that the reception of the Nazi imagery led to him trying to remove it from circulation and not reissuing it when he was reissuing the rest of his early work. But to what degree was there a sort of feedback loop? Was he changing the way his work was going, the depictions of sex and things in his thing based on what the market wanted, what people were telling him they wanted? Was he changing what he was making specifically so it would sell better?
It's hard to say. You do definitely see as he gets older, the figures in the drawings get older and they start to look more like the 70s gay clone. So the early drawings in the early 1950s, they always have cartoonishly large pecs, but they have very narrow little waists in the early drawings, and they're very twinky. And then by the early 1960s, we have Kaka and Pekka and these kind of classic, like Tom of Finland things. And then the facial hair and the crow's feet come in the 80s as the kind of clone look becomes more established. So I guess one of the things that changes is that people start commissioning portraits of themselves. People start commissioning portraits of their lovers. And so that means that Tom is not only drawing fantasy, but is also now drawing a real world that is itself based on the fantasy he helped create. By the way, there is a story that I didn't get to that I have to tell you. One of Tom's commissions was for bad gay, former subject of our show, and opera director and film director Franco Zeffirelli, who had an obsession with Michelangelo's David and had apparently a whole area of his house that was just full of Davids. And so he commissioned a 4.5-foot tall drawing of Michelangelo's David by Tom of Finland with a huge cock. And he was furious because in the drawing, David was circumcised.
Yeah, that's something I found really interesting because there's something I find fascinating about his work, which is the degree to which it is America refracted through a sort of European lens of what they think we think America is, and especially given the sort of political economic history of Europe in the immediate post-war sort of period, when you did have all this money coming through the Marshall Plan, but also, of course, this sort of big plan to not necessarily Americanize, but introduce American culture on a massive scale to Western Europe. And yet he's selling that back to America in the end.
Yeah, but that's often the way it is, right? That like a yardstick, people use each other as yardsticks. Cultures use each other as yardsticks. And
kind of like spaghetti westerns, no?
Very much like spaghetti westerns. There's a few things that has to do with. One of them is the ways in which, and the shapes of these markets as the 50s and 60s and 70s especially evolve, are so shaped by different regimes of censorship, of mail laws. What can you mail back and forth, right? In an era when the mail is what's used to transport printed products, it was often laws about what could be posted that were used to enforce censorship, right? And so there are a few Supreme Court cases in the 1950s that established that it is possible to mail gay material, first of all, at all, and then physique pictorial specifically. And then in Europe, these different censorship regimes mean that stuff is circulating from different places at different times depending on where. So Scandinavia develops a whole place in both the American and the Western European imagination as a source of pornography because stuff could be printed there and then maybe you could get it. But you couldn't necessarily print in Germany or you couldn't necessarily print in the US what you could print in Scandinavia. Or film, in the US it wasn't print, in the US it had to do with films. There was a whole thing in the 1960s of these like Swedish films that were basically circulated in the United States as softcore pornography, whether or not they were intended that way when they were made. And so these imaginations are also driven by the legal situation at any given moment.
This is why in the English imagination, the Germans are absolutely filthy. Purely because it was pornography coming over in the 70s and 80s from Germany, which included stuff that would never be produced in an English market.
Whereas in Germany, the really eye-watering stuff was coming from Scandinavia.
Yeah, and I'm interested in this as well in terms of, this is maybe a quite contentious subject to get onto, but the way that still in Europe, a lot of discourse around both politics and political aesthetics is sort of overcoded by the American experience. That what is happening in America seeps into our conversation about things, but actually our experiences are very different. Finland's history is extremely different from America's history. European history is very different. And how do you think that impacted like the way he was representing race? Because a Northern European like relationship with race is no less problematic, but the way it exists is very different to the way that the American experience of race is. And Did Tom have any friends who were people of colour, men of colour, until he moved to America? Or was the depiction of race somehow related to what he understood as an American, trying to depict like an American ideal?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole tradition of European eroticized depictions of different kinds of racialized people. And I think Tom's fascination with American black men specifically had to do with ideas about black American masculinity and hypermasculinity that circulated both in American culture and then also in European culture, and then which, when they got to Europe, in this kind of post-Marshall Plan, U.S. American culture comes to Europe moment, then intersect with existing European discourses about black Africans as being hypersexualized, a source of sexual threat, but also a source of sexual attraction. So I absolutely think that shaped the way that he depicted these men. I don't know whether or not he had any black friends. I do know that his depiction of black men should be, like all the other aspects of his work, very much up for criticism and debate and discussion, right?
Bad Gays doesn't run ads, we're not part of a big media network, and we're not underwritten by any big donors. That means our analysis and work is independent, critical, and free for the community.
Only through your generous support can we take the time to write and research each of these extensive episodes. Become part of a community of like-minded listeners by subscribing to Extra Bad Gays on Patreon or Apple Podcasts.
Every month, you'll get access to our subscribers-only podcast where we discuss the latest in queer politics and culture, and our Gagging Gunkles advice segments, where we take reader questions about sex, relationships, and queer life.
You don't want to miss those segments, nor do you want to miss our new jingle. So join the community at patreon.com/badgayspod or subscribe right in Apple Podcasts. And you can also check out our merch, including hats, beach towels, t-shirts, and of course our book, Bad Gays, A Homosexual History, at our website, now in English, Spanish, and Italian. Thanks.
Big fan of you guys, the Bad Gays, and also Tom of Finland. And I wanted to say that just for people outside of Finland that no one gets the idea that Turku is a small town. Like, yeah, Turku is a metropolitan culture.
He wasn't living in Turku. He went to high school in Turku, but
Yes.
he was living in a small town outside.
Yeah,
We called it a city.
Yeah.
It's a city.
It's,
We know that.
it's a city. Turku has a castle and all. No shaking of Turku, just people living there. But what I wanted to say, was there anything when you started to look of the history of like Tom of Finland's life, did anything like really surprise you, or did something come up that you didn't like know anything about before you started to do your research?
Yeah, I didn't know that much about his war service, and specifically he spent a short amount of time, but nonetheless probably horrifying, on the Eastern Front. And it's one of those sort of facts that feels like it shrinks time for you a bit, that you can be both a sort of gay man living in LA in the 1990s, like Tom of Finland, in that culture, and also you were someone who fought on the Western Front, on the Eastern Front. And his experience there sounded like horrific. A quote about killing a man was obviously part of it. Yeah, I think that for me was interesting. It was interesting also the way that relates to Finnish relationships with the army and with national service and things.
And swastikas on army uniforms, which a press release recently about the swastika being removed from the Finnish Air Force uniform caused, I'll just tell you, outside of Finland, a response that, this press release raises many questions already answered by the press release. Outside of Finland, the response to that was, wait, what? Good, but what? I was thinking about that same kind of time dislocation, Hugh, when you were just talking about E.M. Forster and thinking about E.M. Forster and Tom of Finland overlapping.
Yeah.
Like all the Kaka books are published before Morris.
Yeah,
And when I like E.M. Forster being exposed to Tom of Finland drawings, if some people say this would kill a Victorian child, like these Tom of Finland drawings would kill a Victorian repressed closeted.
Maybe they did kill the E.M. Forster.
Who knows?
So yeah, I found that very interesting, and his relationship to it. And I do think like he was a really young man. He was 19, 20, and he was conscripted, and I don't put too much weight on his service, of course, in that situation. But it is interesting to what degree that influenced what came afterwards, and the degree to which, as one of the quotes that Ben had, that he from...
Carl Lemonier.
Yeah. He was a gay man, a young gay man surrounded by Nazis. He's not someone looking at this from the outside. He existed through that period, and he had a direct experience of it. Yeah.
I also have one quick question if I sneak in before I get everybody here.
Sure.
Which is, if you can buy the Tom of Finland merch, right, in the UK and stuff, are straight people buying it?
Yes.
So it's the same as here?
Yeah. Yeah, there was actually recently a show in London, and I wrote a catalogue essay for, which was a sort of double-header show of Tom of Finland and an English artist called Beryl Cook, who was a sort of amazing painter. Who, I guess the term in the past might have been an outsider artist, not part of the art world in the same way, but also massively popular, and also made a lot of her profit through selling reproductions and postcards and tea towels. And her sort of style is a sort of saucy seaside English humour. And it was really interesting seeing these two things put together and the huge degree of crossover. And actually you realise that seeing the tea towel that you give to your auntie of a Tom of Finland cowboy grabbing a huge cock through his jeans seems like such a massive leap, but actually it is just a matter of that small step towards gay acceptance, if this makes sense, because those images were already in my house as a teenager, but just of working class women by Beryl Cook, with in the short skirts with the big boobs, having this same sort of relationship with pleasure, and this same sort of camp idea of like a sort of fun and slightly harmless sexuality. I think that's what's quite interesting about the reception of Tom of Finland's work now, is that it's moved into a fun, the oversized cocks and the sort of that sort of thing that was once a source of genuine sexual desire has now moved into a realm of camp. That's why you can have it on the tea towel, I think, whereas other gay pornographic artists from that time who didn't go down that route, I think, haven't been co-opted in the same way.
Yeah, no one's doing maple thurp. People do have maple thurps in there. I think fewer straight people have maple thurps, or maple thurp repros. The fun thing, though, I just want to add to that, the fun thing was part of it the whole time. A huge, important part about Tom of Finland's work is that if you look at it, everyone looks happy to be there. Even people to whom really intense things are happening, people who are being, let's say, stretched to their limits, are really thrilled. And everyone is clearly happy, and everyone is clearly playful, and everyone is clearly cheeky. And that's not the case in the work of some of these other artists that circulated at the time. And I do think it's one of the things that's particularly powerful and interesting about Tom's work is how much it looks like fun. It looks like fun to be there, right?
I wanted to thank you for mentioning the way that sort of race and ethnicity is considered and treated and exists differently in Europe and the United States. As a mixed race person, white and Finnish and Indian, I've always been morbidly fascinated, I guess, with the way that race and ethnicity exists in Europe. Because white Finnish people, even though they may not identify like that, have always talked to me about how we don't think about race. We're all just people, and maybe we talk a little bit about ethnicity, but then I went to an international high school, and so I have a sort of very I have a very diverse and woke friend group. We've always had different experiences with that, and I don't know, I don't really, I guess I do have a question. Do you guys have any more to elaborate on that? Because you guys, it was just one line that you breezed past.
Sure. So my academic research focuses on race, primitivism, and the self-invention of the white gay man. And I look at that in both Germany and the United States. And so the differences between those systems of race and racialization, and also the similarities and the continuities, and also a shifting historical relationship between those systems, right? The systems are not static, and they actually become more like each other over time, is a huge part of my work. There's a really wonderful book by a pair of sisters, one historian and one sociologist named Barbara and Karen Fields. The book is called Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, and it is specifically about the US, but I think it really helps us think about the ways in which what they call racecraft, which is basically the assigning of the concept of race to the fact of difference between people, is an engine for creating and justifying systems of inequality and domination. And so I think that is what those systems share fundamentally. And yet Europe and the United States are both colonial powers. They're colonial powers in different ways. Finland, like the US, actually is in parts settler colonial. The United States entirely settler colonial. Finland partially, right? Much of Europe doesn't have a settler colonial past domestically, but then colonized other parts of the world, right? So like depending on what these like material realities are, depending on who moved where when, places are going to have different relationships with this. What I can tell you is that sexuality, which as a concept, by which I mean the understanding that I have a sexuality that is a constituent part of me, that I can describe as such, and that it's an important part of my understanding of myself as who I am. That is a very new concept. That does not exist before about 1870, which is not to say that there was not gender trouble before 1870, and it's not to say that there weren't people having same-sex contact, relationships, love, sex before 1870. It means that the construction of sexuality as we understand it now, an identity-based approach, is new-ish. Sexuality emerged at the height of European colonial domination, and it emerged in Europe. And it emerged there not because Europe was a uniquely tolerant place, but because Europe was a uniquely intolerant place and was trying to figure out ways to classify, to pathologize, and to label all of these different things that it was identifying as being bad, both in its own domestic working classes and in the people that it was colonizing and subjugating abroad. And so it would be strange if sexuality didn't always have a lot to do with race and ideas about race, and the ideas about race that were created in different places to justify different colonial systems. And so how it works is different in different places. The fact that these things are always already connected is the same in all the places. In the quote-unquote West or the quote-unquote global North or whatever we're talking, whatever framing we want to use for that.
Thank you. I think this was really interesting, and I think I would think somehow also that the way how race is depicted is very maybe from American point of view, since I don't think there were a big population of that big group of black people in Finland at the time, and I think we had maybe more bigger, for example, Romani minority, where that was a big kind of, and still is a racist issue here. But I was wondering, just because of that he depicted a lot of these Nazi uniforms, did he do that with Soviet uniforms? Because I think that was more personal and really also from Finnish point of view, kind of Nazism was also, especially in the military, there was sympathy for that. And then on the other hand, Soviet soldiers and Russians were the enemy, and really there was also this phobia towards Russian people. That was this kind of, is this shown in the work somehow?
I think in his later work there wasn't any depiction of Soviets, but I'm just flicking through the books in my mind mentally. But I think some of his early work in the 1950s with these guys who had these very sort of snatched waists and big shoulders, there was I think there was a bit more nuance around the uniforms. I think there might have been some depictions of not in this way that, again, is a very different way that the culture industry post-war dealt with Nazis and dealt with Soviets, because obviously the Soviet Union was still existing. Whereas in the US especially, but also in Italy and countries like that, you get this sort of explosion in the late 60s, early 70s of Nazi exploitation and sexploitation films which depict Nazis within the same sort of context, like the sort of Isla She-Wolf of the SS era, where they have these, who actually features in it. I actually can't. If anyone's watched the new Ryan Murphy season of Monsters about Ed Gein, Ryan Murphy seems to come up in pretty much every episode recently. There's a big bit on Elsa, the She-Wolf of the SS, which I'm amazed they made. Anyway, but yeah, so you have this sort of stylization and hypersexualization of the Nazis that's happening also in heterosexual culture in 1960s and 70s, within pornography especially, which I don't think is happening in the same way because it is happening with the Soviets for obvious reasons.
Something we haven't really talked about yet, right, is the there's something a little bit socialist realist about Tom's work, right? Like a little bit in its aesthetics. I think it's interesting to compare Tom's work to queer erotic art, especially gay erotic art, that's produced in the Soviet bloc. There's an artist in East Germany named Jürgen Wittdorf, who actually had a lot of state success because he did drawings of young men at sports and stuff like that. Actually, his drawings were recreated as tile murals in the now destroyed East German State Institute of Bodybuilding. But there is like these Wittdorf images. He might not have ever seen a Tom of Finland. And obviously the Wittdorf images they're not fisting each other and they don't have cocks bulging quite as far out of their shorts. But this image of these big, beautiful young men outdoors with big smiles on their faces, there is something related to it, right?
Yeah, I guess it's to do with like idealistic depictions of ideologies.
Right, yeah, and it's like there's almost something almost pastoral about them. They're like filthy Fragonards.
Yeah, I think also the way that both capitalist and communist societies in the immediately post-war period are trying to deal with the idea of the master worker and representations of the master worker. And you're right, like that's one of the things that is really interesting, I guess, about Tom's drawings is that they're always of working class men in various roles, except from cops, depending on how you judge cops. But yeah, and they are the creation of a sort of expanded idea of what is like an acceptable sort of working class male body, behavior, identity, but coming from a completely different direction.
Hi. Just a short comment on maybe the aesthetics of the drawings themselves. That I remember someone pointed it out to me that despite this sort of hyper-masculine subjects, the drawings themselves are actually also quite like soft and feminine. And if you like really look at the figures, it feels like they're actually rendered from this very bouncy, like round, carefully shaded shapes. And then I think once you see it, then you like, I don't know, like that there's like this interesting paradox, like in the aesthetic itself. And I guess we've been talking a lot, or like you've been discussing a lot, the kind of masculinity of them, but then they are actually like really, like there's not a lot of like hard angles, or the sort of the way that they're made actually feels really like it almost flips like again to the other side. And I wonder if that has something to do with their like staying power or like their distinction from other similar material.
Yeah, I think the drawing style also has a lot to do with the dominant aesthetics of advertising at the beginning of Tom's career. The photorealistic advertising drawing as a medium. Like I'm working on a fashion project right now, and so I'm looking at a lot of 50s and 60s fashion magazines, and there many ads through the 60s had big, like photorealistic drawings of people that all have this kind of render style, right, where they're all very like carefully shaded and they almost look brushed or breathed onto the paper, and it all is very impermeable, and the faces are always slightly generic. And yeah, the other interesting thing about Tom is that I think we all have this very strong image of what the drawings look like, right? This very careful shading, but he used different techniques over the course of his career. So sometimes he worked with pencil, sometimes he worked with charcoal, sometimes he worked with ink, and oftentimes it had to do with where he thought the work was going to be reproduced and how what was the quality of the print in the repro. He was really interested not only in how it would look as the original, but also when this gets reproed, what is the level of quality of the printing? Therefore, what should I do with the original to get the end result to look the way that I want it to look? Which is another, he was talking about like someone who's really interested in how the work is going to circulate and less interested in the kind of purity of the originals. He was also apparently amazed by the fact that people liked the sketches because he thought the sketches were unfinished. And now, of course, the sketches, like there are entire shows of Tom of Finland sketches, which are very different, right, from these drawings. So you just see how he's working out the composition. In some cases, I find them more compelling than the final drawings, but anyway.
Yeah, this look, the one behind us, which is the classic Tom of Finland look, is quite different from the comics. But what I find interesting about it in terms of the way they're produced is there's no focus in terms of the lines. There's a democracy of line. Everything is depicted in the same level of detail, pretty much. Maybe that's something to do with like the focus of his design being like the whole man. But he creates quite like a flat image in a strange way. There's also interesting things about the way he composes the images, which is very few of them are inside. Like there's a strange relationship with nature he has going on. There's lots of guys fucking in the woods. And obviously his early work about lumberjacks makes sense. But later on, you continue to have these cowboys fucking in the woods and cops fucking in the woods. It's not an urban world that he's like actually depicting. And also that very often there's like a strange point of focus in terms of who's looking. That there are people fucking, but you're not necessarily the one looking at the image. There's always other people in the image watching what's happening, which is like a sort of nice, I don't know, nod maybe to the cruising experience.
Certainly.
I don't know, yeah, it's interesting a point though about there, like how you like gender shapes in that way. Why is roundness equated with softness, equated with femininity? I guess just in pure physicality in terms of not gendered norms of bodies. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point, especially about how the longevity of it comes from the fact that they're actually quite non-threatening images, even though they can be quite extreme. You like that there is a guy getting fisted, but it's quite a beautiful image of a guy getting fisted. And as Ben said, everyone's having a good time. There's a sort of implication or threat of violence, and this fits in with the sort of kink discourse and why it's so popular within the idea of a fetish community, is that the threat is somehow neutralized within the image.
There was quite a few mentions of Mannerheim in this episode. There's been a lot of heated debate in Finland around his possible queerness. Have you considered, or could you consider him as one topic of one episode?
That is so funny because we were backstage looking at the script, and he was like looking up how to pronounce Mannerheim and found the Wikipedia page and showed me the picture and said, "Look at this queen." So the fact that there is discourse about this delights me, and we will absolutely look into it. Thank you.
No, yeah, in the discussion about who we were going to do, because we thought Tom of Finland is an obvious choice. So we had a long conversation with various people about who else we could choose. And Mannerheim, it basically came down to Mannerheim or Tom of Finland. And it was mainly down to like sources and how much because from what we found in our researching is there's this indiscretion that happens when he's a cadet, which is never really named. It seems to potentially be around homosexuality, but it was probably just not quite enough to make an episode out of it. But then the other night, I think I saw someone take out. I was talking with someone at the event last night, and he was saying that there is this sort of rumor of who inherited Mannerheim's gay porn collection when he died. And it's still out there. Someone's got Mannerheim's wank bank. There's 3 words I've never been put together before.
Yeah, hi. The thing that you were saying earlier about how in Tom's drawings, everyone looks happy to be there. And that's one of the things that I've always found like the most compelling about it, is the fact that everybody looks genuinely pleased to be there. It was just like happy as fuck.
It's fun both to beat them up and to meet them.
No, exactly. And like I was more thinking about the impact that kind of depiction of even fairly spicy, sexy stuff might have had on the kink scene later on, or even at the time, as these are things that you can do for fun, consensually. Because I feel like there's a lot of material that sort of that deals with power and power dynamics, and it's very within the fantasy, someone is being ravaged, possibly in a way that they don't enjoy. But here it's always very like, everyone's into it. Even the guy getting flogged is grinning. And I think that's lovely and also interesting.
They're also the same men.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the one getting fucked, in terms of bodies and shapes and like depictions, the power dynamic is shifted in terms of the guy getting fucked is also the big muscly guy. I think that kind of feeds into a lot of what Ben was saying, and there's this quite flat, basic critique of Tom of Finland, which is that he is buying into some sort of homonormative, like representation of gay male masculinity. But actually, at the time, it wasn't normative at all, because the normative depiction of homosexual masculinity was faggotry in a negative sense.
Yeah, and the thing that Tom's pictures don't show you is there are some erotic artists who are more interested in the moment of the power exchange fantasy when the sub is pretending not to want it or thinks they don't want it. And then in that fantasy description, there's the kind of eroticized moment of being overcome. And then there's the moment eventually when, usually, in the way that most of these are set up, the sub is really having the absolute time of their life. And Tom swoops in and shows you that. Like, you get the moment when everybody is real happy to be there. And yeah, I do think it's artistically compelling and interesting. And as we've said, what makes them also acceptable in a way, right? There are certain Rex drawings that I don't think even your aunt, who likes Tom of Finland, would want to have in her house. And she might not be able to define that as the difference, but I'd hazard a guess that's part of what it is, right? That the Tom drawings are showing us a moment where everyone is clearly thrilled to be there and where, at least in the image, all of the problems have been sorted out.
But I think this is the questioner's point. I think it's very astute, which is a lot of those other images which show the peril, the not wanting it, the overcoming, the realizing you enjoy it. And it's like they depict the process of not wanting it and then having your realizations changed by the experience. Whereas what's clear in Tom's is that you can go out on an evening wanting to be fisted. From the start, it's 10 o'clock and I'm going to go to the club and I want to be held down and fisted from the start. And the play around pretending that that you don't want it is absent. And then that's the way it's shaped kink discourse in terms of people can go out there from the start saying, I want to be the messy bottom slut getting fucked by 10 guys tonight. And that's okay.
And now I have audio of you saying that. Weird. No, that's what I was going to say. What I was going to say was, as much as we talked about the kind of trade fantasy as part of this, right, that's also a difference from the actual trade fantasy, right? Like, in the trade fantasy, the trade doesn't really give a shit about you.
Yeah.
And here, you get to look like the trade, and then also maybe you'll fist someone after you're fisted, right? This is also the moment, like the moment of invert pervert turning into gay guys is also the moment of the invention of verseness, which really wasn't a thing before this period, and becomes in the 70s and 80s really normative that people are supposed to be verse. And then there's a whole kind of history of that and of the invention of the bottom. I can't get into it. We always end our show by debating between ourselves, bad, gay, bad, not gay, not bad, not gay. And so what we are going to do tonight is our live show method, where we will make our own judgment, but we're also going to use the audience own meter. So I'm going to offer you 3 options because I think we can all agree gay.
I was going to say, this is another sentence that's never been uttered before. Was Tom of Finland gay? Does anyone clap now if you think that there's some doubt and Tom of Finland wasn't gay? No. Okay.
Moving on. We're going to do in the following order: good, bad, complicated. So clap if you think Tom of Finland was a good gay. Clap if you think Tom of Finland was a bad gay. Clap if you think Tom of Finland was a complicated gay. And we agree with you. So that's why we clapped during that as well, which you probably hear on our microphones. If you are interested in learning more about Tom of Finland, we would recommend reading Tom of Finland, His Life and Times by the extraordinarily named F. Valentine Hooven III.
There was also a very interesting website on myhelsinki.fi, and the title was Tom of Finland's Helsinki. And anyone who, like me, who's interested in historical tours and giving tours, there's a whole bunch of places that you can go to and see where he lived and see where he cruised and see where he served in the army. That's a great website.
There's also a essay, academic article by Hunter Scott called Facing Sameness, Reconsidering the Radicality of Tom of Finland. And then an article from Kunstkritik called The Cult of Iconified Homosexuality. That's a review of that Chiasma show that is very good. And then 2 pieces of theory that helped me think about the meaning of this kind of kink play. One of them is Swastika Toys by Arnie Kantrowitz in the collection Leatherfolk, and the other is from The Essential, Lux magazine, Morally Erect, about the Dirk Daner Nazi gear scandal at the Tom of Finland Foundation, and that is by Carla Monier. Before we actually get off stage, we have to do a couple things.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to Jamie and Ella and Sasha and the crew and cast here. That's been great.
Yes, a big round of applause for them, please. And that is the end of our show and the end of our season. So until next season, bye.
Bye.
Bad.